the Sunday that's actually designated for the lesson. Today we come to session 6 of a group of lessons that's entitled After God's Own Heart, a fresh look at the Ten Commandments. And I have to admit to you, when we started on this, when I first reviewed these series of lessons, I thought, well, this will be pretty mundane, might not be very interesting, but I've really enjoyed it, probably more than most series of lessons that we have. It's been truly a fresh look at the Ten Commandments. Too often we think of the Ten Commandments as this thing that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai, and it's kind of Old Testament, and Jesus kind of redid them a little bit, and we don't really see just what the heart is there and how they're interrelated, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament. If you recall, the first lesson was covered the first 2 commandments. That is, that you should have no other gods before God, and you should not make any graven image or no idols. And really the idea of that lesson was to put God first. And that's really the kind of the key to everything we do today, is that we put God first. The second session we looked at was entitled Honor God, and we looked at the 3rd and 4th commandments. The 3rd one is don't misuse the name of God. And I particularly enjoyed some of the discussion we had there in terms of how extensive the name of God is, and how sometimes maybe when we take His name casually, we may be using His name in vain, and we have to be very careful about that. The 4th commandment I was also covered that week was maintaining the Sabbath. And again, there's some implications of that I'm not sure that I'd ever quite considered. Session 3 was honor parents, that is, honor thy father and thy mother. What I really enjoyed about that, or some things I learned there, is that one is that I really like the idea of this being called a transitional or a bridge commandment. The first 4 talks about how we relate to God. The 6 through 10 talk about how we relate to others. But this is kind of a in-between of our bridge, the aspect and it's not just our father and mother, it really extends to our family. Then if we bring in the New Testament aspect of that, I think it brings in the church family. And so it becomes much more extensive than just honoring our mother and father. The 4th session was honor life, that is, thou shalt not murder. And the 5th one was honor marriage, thou shalt not commit adultery. And as we went those through, as I approached those 2 lessons, I thought, well, those 2 I don't have much trouble with. I've never murdered anyone, I've never committed adultery, so I'm in good shape. Then we start seeing how Jesus expands those from murder, that if you think ill of a person, you can commit murder without actually killing a person. And same way with adultery. If you have lust in your heart, that's a form of adultery according to Jesus. So it becomes much more severe in terms of the interpretation when Jesus makes those applications. Well, today we're going to be looking at commandments 8, 9, and 10. And I'm not sure why they put all 3 together. I kind of wish we'd taken our time, and I think each one of them obviously are extremely important. We're going to be looking at thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, and thou shalt not covet, and which are the ones that we'll be looking at today. The point of the lesson today is integrity and contentment in Christ form the foundation for good relationships. Now, integrity, you can think of, this is kind of our outer appearance. This is what is our relationship with others in terms of integrity. Contentment is that inner aspect. One writer says is when what is outside matches what is, when what is inside matches what is outside, then you have integrity. And that's the aspect of, we get to the point of, I love where over in Peter describes Jesus as one who did not sin, neither was any guile found in his mouth. Guile, that's the idea of deceit. And that, to me, that's the real form of this integrity that there's no guile found within us. Well, in your book on page 73, it talks about structure, implosion of a structure, and talk about how they, when they're wanting to implode something, they'll put explosions at a very strategical places, and the building or whatever structure they're wanting to bring down will collapse. And they make the point that it only takes, and when that's done right, it occurs very rapidly to bring a building or a structure down. And they make the point that it only takes a second for a relationship to implode. One lie can collapse a friendship. One slanderous accusation can destroy people's perception of us. And really, that one lie, that one accusation, slanderous accusation, can destroy our integrity. And that's something that is a real demand on our lives today. How many lies do you have to make to be a liar? Obviously, just one. How many things do you have to steal to be a thief? Just one thing. How many things do you have to covet to become a coveter? It's only one. So there's a very strong line, or a very pure line, that God calls us to throughout these last 3 Ten Commandments. And these point to these 8th, 9th, and 10th commandments point to the kind of character that God's people need to exhibit in relationship with others. That they demand that we tell the truth, refuse to take advantage of others, and live without envy. Those are pretty high standards as you think about them. So let's look at these. The 8th commandment is Exodus 20:15. It says, "Thou shalt not steal." And here again, very much like we saw in the last couple of weeks, where it says, "Do not murder," "Thou shalt not commit murder," "Thou shalt not commit adultery." This is you could interpret this as we did, as never murder, never commit adultery. Here again would be kind of the force of this language could be interpreted as never steal, not just do not steal. This range of do not steal over in Exodus, it included prohibition on both burglary and kidnapping. So it was a little bit wider than sometimes we think of just as stealing. And if you remember the law of Moses required that burglars return twice the amount they stole as recompense to the person they stole from. Therefore, the thieves would end up losing the precise amount that they hoped to gain. So there was some real penalty involved with that. This 8th commandment, do not steal, actually implies that that we should have, or that we can have legal possession and personal ownership of things. That implication is within that commandment. So because you couldn't steal if people didn't own things. And underlying that is really the respect for ownership. And I think that's the real key to what God is putting forward here in terms of the commandment of thou shalt not steal, is that you not only don't take things, but you, in contrast to that, you respect that other person. You know, in today's time, we see, in our culture today, we see a lot of theft. We see on our TVs in the last few weeks all the looting that has occurred in the United States and associated with protest. And that's, I don't have a real problem with them protesting, but when they start looting, that's thou shalt not steal. That's really coming back to basic law. I was really amused, or at least saw something very different. Several years ago, I visited Spain, and there I was really delighted in the small communities. You'd see children, even after dusk or after sundown, they would run freely in the streets without adult supervision. They felt very safe, and indeed they were very safe. So I thought that was really neat in that community. But then the next day I went with a group and stopped at a little place to eat lunch. I got out of the car and I just left my camera in there, and they said, no, you do not leave a camera or anything like that, because it would get stolen. And it really, it's kind of curious. They said that you didn't have to worry about being bodily assaulted, but they'd steal a shirt off your back. So it's just a little bit different. I experienced something just a couple of years ago. My dad had left, had some old two-row farm equipment left out in the barn, and it had sentimental value, but not very much market value. Well, some guy was renting our mom and dad's house, and he ended up leaving. We went out there to look over the damage and found that he had taken all that farm equipment, I'm sure, and sold it for scrap iron. And the sense of that was really was a very personal. That was a violation of my personal space. That equipment itself was not real valuable, but it belonged to my dad, and in that sense, it had a real personal value. And that's anytime a person steals from another, they're invading that personal space of that person and not respecting, showing disrespect for that person. But one of the writers indicated that stealing goes way beyond just stealing property. You can break the 8th commandment in more subtle ways. For example, you might be guilty of stealing time from your employer if you put your time in as different from what you've actually worked. You may take some possessions, small things. I know down here at the experiment station, it seems that hand tools sprout feet and walk away. Those things just disappear. Some of them are just simply lost out in the field, but others are taken by employees and ones that happen to be there at the station. Working on personal projects on company time, and even to the point of not performing well in your employment is a degree of stealing. You're not giving your employer what they're paying for. I ran across a verse this week that really and I'm not real sure how to interpret it. It wasn't in the book, so I didn't have any interpretation. Luke 6:30, Jesus tells us how to respond to theft. And he says, give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. And he goes on, do to others as you would have them do to you. That's a pretty tough statement. When I have something stolen from me, I want it back. I do not go that extra mile that Jesus is saying here. And I think that's a real, I'm not sure exactly how to completely interpret that. In the same way, give to him who asks you. If you go out here in the street and start giving to everyone that asks, you're going to be broke pretty soon. I think Jesus is saying this in a context for us not to hold on to things, that we are to be generous, but I think he's also saying that we should be wise. Well, the 9th commandment is another strong commandment. It says, strong language says, do not give false witness against your neighbor. This idea, and I really like over in Leviticus 5:1, kind of takes this a little bit farther. It says, if a person sins because he does not speak up when he hears a public charge to testify, I'm sorry, I've gotten ahead of myself. That has to do with the 10th commandment. Let me come back. The point is here. No, it should be. I'm in the right place. Let me try it again. Maybe I'll get my brain working. If a person sins because he does not speak up when he hears a public charge to testify regarding something he has seen or heard about, he will be held responsible. The idea here is, in terms of giving false witness, is we must speak up. It's not just not to lie, is what the writer here was trying to make the point. And I think that's an interesting thing, is certainly we should not bear false witness, but a part of bearing false witness is keeping your mouth shut and not speaking up when you see something violated. The term neighbor is a much broader term. It's not our just physical neighbor. It takes in very similar to what Jesus, when he talked about the Good Samaritan, and when he was asked, who is my neighbor? And that's the aspect of anyone that we have dealings with in our world today, with the type of communication we have. Essentially, everyone becomes our neighbor. And really fundamental to this command of not bearing false witness is that the Lord is the God of truth. If you look over in 1 Samuel 15:29, Samuel, it says, "He who is the glory of Israel, that is God, does not lie or change his mind, for he is not man that he should change his mind." Aren't you glad that God doesn't change his mind? He is, and that he does not lie. And similar over in Hebrews 6:18 is a similar statement about God's integrity. It says, "God did this so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope offered to us may be greatly encouraged." I love this aspect. It is impossible for God to lie. You know, I wish that for us as people that it'd be impossible for us to lie, but we seem to be able to do it quite well. Then finally, in Proverbs 6:11 through 19. No, I'm sorry, 16 through 19. I can't read my own writing. It says, "There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue," that's basically what we're talking about here, "hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises evil schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, and then a false witness who pours out lies, and a man who stirs up dissension among brothers." So this false witness is a very high on God's list of things that he hates. On page 74, down at the bottom, it says, "Loving one another includes speaking the truth in love at all times." Many people excuse a lie, calling it only a little white lie. And I like this. A little white lie is like being a little pregnant. It'll always show up after a while. So, you know, this is the idea. And then it says lies have a way of creating boomerang effect, coming back to us to cause a lot of damage. It's like a man who didn't want his neighborhood kids eating his watermelon. So he puts up his sign and says, "One of these is poisonous." But he comes back the next day and some very clever kid marked out the one and put 2 of these are poisonous. So he lost his whole crop because he didn't know which one, the other one that might be poisonous. So, you know, lies, deception has a way coming around and hurting the one coming back. And it really comes down to, you know, this aspect of dishonesty in general is what is talking about in this 9th commandment. Not just talking about to give false witness in a court case. It's the aspect of lying at any time. You remember Jesus over in John 8:44 characterized the devil as a liar and the father of lies. So anytime lies start coming out of our mouth, that's Satan working through us. He's the father of lies. In contrast, God desires integrity in the inner self. That is, to be pure within, and then and what is within will come out as truth. So God, these 8th and 9th commandments talks about God requiring integrity in both our action and in our speech. So now let's look at the 10th commandment, Exodus 20:17. Do not covet your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's wife, his male or female servant, his house, his ox or donkey, or anything belongs to your neighbor. Coveting really deals more with attitude rather than action. I think most of the things we do wrong, it starts off inside as a form of coveting, and then it translates into stealing, into murder, adultery, all of these other sins. In the same way, in similar way, coveting is really internal, and it can be rather than external. I liked on page 76, it talks about this, one of Aesop's fables. It talks about this dog crossing a bridge, had a bone in his mouth. He looks down into the water and he sees what he thinks is a bigger dog and a bigger bone. He opens his mouth trying to get that bigger bone, and obviously loses what he has. And it says, not being satisfied with what you already have is the quickest path toward losing it. And that's this covetousness really is bound up with the lack of contentment. The grass is always greener. There's things that seem like you need a little bit more. And when is enough? There's never enough. When you have that kind of focus of wanting things or wanting something else. It says the term covet identifies an excessive, ungoverned, selfish desire. That's really, as we talk about many times, the real heart of sin comes back to self. And when we put self before God. When the Lord enabled the Israelites to conquer their enemies, his people, he said, his people must not, he told that his people must not covet the gold and silver used in construction of these enemies' idols. And we see that violated time and time again in the Old Testament. Well, here he says, it says we should not covet the neighbor's house. And the Old Testament word for house can refer to family and property, not just the building. So when we observe this commandment warns against coveting people as well as coveting things. And perhaps we get into aspect of coveting and envying people more so than really things very often. And then I thought it was really curious, interesting, that this 10th commandment stands apart from all the others because it focuses on our internal attitudes, and the sinful thought will then precede the sinful act. And that some people refer to this commandment as the blanket commandment, on the basis that if we refuse to covet that which belongs to another, we won't break any of the others. So it really, the idea that the sinning against God and sinning against our family, sinning against other people, sin really has its initiation starting point within us. And if we cut it off at that point, then we don't have any problem with the other sins. While the violation of the 10th commandment may not be evident to others, it is obvious to God because He sees our hearts. We may have this coveting another person or another thing, and we think, well, it doesn't hurt anyone else because it's my thing, but it hurts our relationship with God. Now, we go look at Psalm 34. It's kind of an application of this aspect of integrity and contentment relative to God. And this is David's writing. And again, as we've studied throughout this series, we've even either looked at events in David's life or some of David's writings. This 37th Psalm is in the category of wisdom psalms. It's an acrostic, which means that every verse begins with a different letter of the Hebrew language. Of course, that gets lost, the acrostic aspect of it gets lost in our translation to English. Verses 1 through 6 says, "Do not be agitated by evildoers. Do not envy those who do wrong, for they wither quickly like grass and wilt like tender plants." That reminds us of, if you look back, Psalm 1, as David kind of uses that same language. Verse 3, it says, "Trust in the Lord and do what is good. Dwell in the land and live securely. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you your heart's desires. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him, and he will act, making your righteousness shine like the dawn, your justice like noonday." Well, in verse 1, he starts off with a couple of do nots. First of all, it says, "Do not be agitated by evildoers." The word agitated here means to burn or to be kindled, and the aspect of not to be agitated by evildoers. As I thought about that this week, I have a problem with that. I have a personal problem. When I see people protesting and doing evil in the streets, I get agitated by it. When I see wrongdoing, it's to some extent we need to be agitated, but we should not let that take over our lives. And I think that's what God is saying in here. The second do not is do not envy those who do wrong. And that really goes right to what some of these commandments that we just covered. And the question as I thought about this is, why would we envy those who do wrong? You know, that's kind of a curious way of thinking about that. And I suspect the reason we envy them, because if we look around, it seems that the evildoers are winning. They perhaps have more money, have more possessions, have more, what they may think is happiness. And it's very easy to kind of to fall in that trap, that thinking that that they are doing better than we are. The word envy here could also be translated being jealous, and that's that same aspect. And I think what the psalmist is really instructing believers is not to allow these evil people who temporarily will seem that they're succeeding. Don't let them agitate them and do not let them agitate you or make you envious. And I think we can probably look at David's life, and he had experienced these situations where he was in very difficult situation, and he had to learn to trust on the Lord and to make things right. And as he did that, he saw that the evildoers, they might win today, but in the long run, God will overcome that. In verse 2, David starts viewing the life from a long-term perspective. He says that these evildoers, this power and prosperity that they may accomplish, will wither quickly like grass. And I thought it was interesting. He said in biblical Palestine, grass grew quickly following the winter and spring rains, and then when the rain stopped and it got very hot, it would wither very quickly. So in Scripture, the term grass is symbolic of humanity's transitory nature. And that's, if you think in terms of us in perspective of eternity, we're only here a few moments, and we may be green like grass, but we can quickly wither. And then the second analogy that he uses that they'll wilt like tender green plants. Again, expressing this fleeting earthly life existence. So like vegetation, the wicked will flourish for a while, and that flourishing is really their worldview, but then ultimately they will be overcome. Now, in contrast, beginning in verses 3, he gives 7 directives for wise men, for wise people. First of all is trust in the Lord. And I always think of Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. And that's really the ultimate of how we, as we put our trust in the Lord, rather than in things of ourselves or things of this world, then God will make our path straight, and when we don't lean on our own understanding. So the first thing he directs them to do is to trust in the Lord. The second thing he says is do what is good, which sometimes becomes difficult in a world that is dominated by evil. James 2:26 says trust or faith must be accompanied by good deeds. The wise, God gracious, I can't read my writing again. Well, I'll leave it there. Trust must be accompanied by good deeds, and this is this is the way we become wise. The third directive that he gives them is to dwell in the land. Now, for David to dwell in the land was certainly talking about Israel. It says to dwell in this land. Don't go off into basically another world. I think for us today, to dwell in the land would be indicative of for us to dwell in the Christian life, to dwell with the Holy Spirit, let the Holy Spirit dwell with us, and we have that familiarity and continuity with God. The fourth directive is to live securely. And again, in the Old Testament, it was to stay in the land of Israel, protect yourself, and live securely. I think for us, it may be more of have this abiding faith that we know that, like Romans 8:28, that all things work together for good for them who love the Lord. And this have that security that all things are working and God will work through those things for us. The fifth directive is to take delight in God. To delight or to enjoy, to find pleasure in or satisfaction. How many of us really enjoy the Lord? How many what is the things you delight in? Certainly for me, you can look at the things where your affection, your attention, how you spend your time. That's really going to show you what you really delight in. Certainly my grandchildren, I delight in them. They get my attention, they get my affection, they get my time. And that's how I show. We should have that same type of enjoyment, same type of delight that we might have for our grandchildren or for some other thing. We should have that same type of desire toward the Lord. The sixth directive is to commit your way to the Lord. Commit your way. That's establishing a course in your life that you are committed. And in our next group of lessons, we're going to be talking more about a life of commitment. And we'll be coming back to that word very, very often in the next 7 weeks. But the committing our way, that is basically turning ourselves over to God, putting us into His hands. Then the seventh directive is a repeat of the first one. It says, trust in Him. And this one writer says, while David instructed believers up in the first, in verse 3, the first directive, to demonstrate trust by doing good, here he's teaching them to reflect trust by waiting on the Lord to act. And that's one of the most important ways that we can understand how God is working in our lives, is not to get too far ahead of Him. Then after these 6 directives, he gives us, there's 4 responses that God gives us in these verses. In verse 4, he says that He will give you your heart's desires. I thought about this week is, what is my heart's desires? What is my heart's desire? There are certain aspects we certainly want life and health, and both for ourselves and our loved ones. This writer says, when people live in close fellowship with the Lord, their desires will be in line with God's will and purposes. And that's where, this is what our real heart's desires. Not to get $1 million, not to win football games maybe, but our real true heart's desire is to have our desires lined up with God's will and purposes so that each step we take is in obedience to Him. The second response there in verse 5, it says that God will act. In verse 5 says, take delight, that commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will act. And that was kind of an interesting take on this word, is that once we put our trust in Him, then God takes care of it. He will act in His time. It's not necessarily in our time. The third directive is that He will make your righteousness shine, and the fourth one is that He will make your justice like noonday. And this righteousness and justice refer to evidence of the Lord's sovereignty over this world. And as we put our trust in Him, then His righteousness will shine like the dawn, and His justice will be like noonday. Now, and I think that's really what that's saying, that it'll be very clear what He is doing in our lives. As a consequence of that, then we come to contentment. On page 78, it has Philippians 4:11 through 13, where Paul penned the secret to contentment. He says, I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I find myself. I know how to make do with little, and I know how to make do with a lot. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being content, whether well-fed or hungry, whether in abundance or in need. I am able to do all things through Him who strengthens me. Powerful verses, and this is really where I think what God wants us to get to that point, that to be content. Whatever our circumstances are, that we do not go about coveting other things, we do not steal, we do not murder, adultery, all of these other sins, that we have a contentment, and so that we are able to do all things through Him who strengthens me. I was listening to David Jeremiah this morning, and he happened to refer to Jesus' commands or Jesus' statements over in Matthew 22, verses 36 through 40. And this is where the Pharisees were asking us, Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus replied, love the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like this, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. So obviously what Jesus did, He summed up the whole 10 commandments and really literally the whole Old Testament into 2 commands. And David Jeremiah listed this. He says that these 2 commands really has to do with love, that our priority should be love, and then you can break that down into 3 aspects of love. First of all, the first priority is to love God. And this obviously goes back to the first 2 commandments that are the 10 commandments of putting God first, that we put Him first, and we can only put Him first when we love Him and love Him most. The second priority is to love neighbors. And he made a statement I thought was real interesting. He says, loving neighbors, what that really is sharing the compassion of Christ with others. Sometimes, it's loving others doesn't mean that we always just love and accept them exactly the way they are and say everything's okay. Sometimes loving others requires some discipline. You remember Jesus disciplined the Pharisees. He very often referred to them as hypocrites, not behind their back. He referred to them in their face to say that they were hypocrites in what they were doing. He was reprimanding them, and sometimes that sharing compassion is not just hugging, sometimes there's some reprimand involved with loving neighbors. The third thing he said that the priority, first of all, to love God, secondly, love our neighbors, and thirdly, we are to love ourselves. And we're to love others love our neighbors as ourselves, which just implies that we first should love ourselves. And this is not, we don't need to take this into the, Satan will take this and cause egotism and self to take over and become a sin. But there should be aspects of self-esteem and loving ourselves, and that can only be done as God, as we love God and God expresses Himself through us. Well, that is like I said, Jesus kind of broke it down into very easy to understand the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are very basic to our relationship with God, and as we can apply that to the point of loving God with all our heart, mind, and soul, and then loving others as ourselves, then we don't have to really worry about the letter of the law of the Old Testaments, because it will come out as a very natural aspect. Well, I hope that this has been a fresh look at the Ten Commandments for you. It certainly has been for me, and we can have a better understanding of what God was directing for Israel, and certainly it still is very applicable today. So I indicated before, next week we'll go into a series of 7 lessons of talking about a life of commitment. And we often talk about that. Today's world, commitment is kind of people are not as good to make commitments and fulfill commitments as they perhaps did in another generation. And perhaps we'll be looking at that in the next few weeks. So with that, let me close us with prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for who you are. We thank you for these commandments that you give us that simply outline how we can relate to you. Lord, help us to have a vision of you, to always be able to love you with all our hearts, minds, and souls. Point out to us ways that we err in doing that, and the ways that we can improve. And then also help us love others as ourselves. We thank you for the way it's a very simple command, but we also see commandments and we see that it's very difficult to fully obey. Lord, help us and help us as we go forward. We ask these things in your name. Amen.